This is Words Aptly Spoken, which comes from Proverbs 25:11. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. The written word is a precious treasure. We want to preserve written knowledge for God's glory and as an anchor to the history of the church and its classical conversations. We hope to encourage the reading of words and of the word.
All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Words Aptly Spoken, where Lee Borton's Timothy Knotts and I discuss books from the Classical Conversations curated curriculum. That's good alliteration. This is a series for lovers of the Word made flesh, and it is Wednesday, September 11th, 2024. I'm Jennifer Courtney, and today we are joined by Amy Jones, one of our favorite Classical Conversations instructional designers. So thanks for joining us, Amy.
Thank you for having me. This has been a delightful read, so I'm looking forward to our discussion. It'll be fun.
Good. Well, today, as I said, it is September 11th, so I wanted to just, of course, start off by acknowledging the special place that this day has in our nation's history and allow you guys to share anything that's on your heart and mind today. I have memories of this day mostly because I was just out of the hospital. My daughter was 1 week old to the day on September 11th, and I was out walking her in the stroller. My mom had taken my son. So I had this moment of just me and the baby, and my neighbor pulled up and rolled down the window and said, are you not aware of the news? And of course I wasn't. I had a brand new baby and was walking her. So we walked home and of course, like everyone else, became glued to the screen for the next, 2 or 3 days and just praying for those families. So how about you guys?
Yeah, I was at the dentist with my children. They were all in the back, having they were all young, and so the screen was on, and then it broke to the news, and everyone in the waiting room, we were just all stunned. I just remember just trying to imagine it. Like, is this real? I mean, I think we were all just sitting there looking at each other like, this is so awkward to be in a dentist waiting room watching this happen, and just the stunned silence, and just trying to grapple with that reality. It was really unimaginable. So and how do you live in light of that? So the rest of the day you just went around, I felt pretty numb by it and very sad. It's horribly tragic and frightening. So yeah.
Yeah, it's hard in some instances to even say September 11th without saying 2001
Yes.
after it. In September 11th, 2024 doesn't sound quite right. Yeah, I remember I was in my bedroom and my roommates had the TV on, and I came out of the room and said, "What movie are you watching?" So it was like, this can't be real, right? Some movie that someone made, and I was like, yeah, it was surreal, very much, and hard to process all those thoughts, even 23 years later.
Yes.
Yeah, I've just remembered why my mom had my son. She actually had him at Bible Study Fellowship. She was attending that year and taking him to the children's program. And so her memory is that the whole BSF group stopped, of course, and prayed. So that's a good memory for her, as hard as it was, but just knowing that she was surrounded by fellow Christians who were joining in prayer. So that's anyway, well, we continue to pray and be thankful for those families who sacrificed loved ones to help. And so we'll keep that memory alive. So Tim, do you want to tell us about our shows this month?
Sure. So this month we're exploring CC's parent resource recommendations. So it's a little different than most months where we're in the curriculum itself. Last week we had a lot of fun playing with Dominic O'Brien's book, How to Develop a Brilliant Memory. Today we get to talk about The Paideia of God by Douglas Wilson. And next week we're off for some on-site meetings, but the end of the month we'll wrap up with Echo and Celebration by our very own Lee Bortons.
Yeah, that'll be a fun episode. You can access all of our past episodes if you missed any of those particularly, it sounds like I had to miss How to Develop a Brilliant Memory. It sounds like that was a fun game playing one. So if you want to access any of those past episodes, they are on Lee's YouTube channel at Lee Bortons, or you can go to her website, leebortons.com, and go to the Words Aptly Spoken archives there. So, all right, Tim, you want to get us started on today's book?
Yeah, so usually, Jennifer, you ask Lee why the book that we're studying or talking about is in the curriculum, but since this is a parent resource and since Lee's away today, I'll ask you, why do we recommend the Paideia of God to parents?
Well, I don't want to steal too much of our conversation about Paideia, but so I'll just give a little teaser because we're going to talk more about that word. But one reason that the book is in our Cultivating Classical Leaders resources is that word Paideia, which has the idea of ushering our children into fully orbed Christian living. And so that's one reason that the book is in our parent resources. But also, it's a book that really Wilson doesn't pull a lot of punches. Let me say it that way. He can be aggressive and very forthright when he wants to be. And so he's really dispelling a lot of things that parents have probably accepted about education. And why should we call those things into question? So I can give one little example, which is in the chapter on the biblical meaning of school clothing. He's talking about the idea that if you dress casually, and your pastor dresses casually, and your kids dress casually at school and everywhere else, then you start to think casually. And so I actually, for years, when I tutor Challenge 2 and we're doing polysyllogisms and the traditional logic 2 curriculum, I always bring in that chapter and read it to them because he has a multifaceted argument that gets him from casual clothing to casual thinking. And it's so interesting to do that with young people because, again, Wilson is rubbing against where we are in our current culture. We have this strong desire to be casual. And so it's fun to let the students wrestle with that idea of formality of clothing and leading to formality of thinking. So he does a lot of that throughout the book, just helping challenge what we think about education and just leaning into some topics that are important for us as families to think about. And particularly, he's got some chapters at the end about evangelical colleges and Christian colleges and what should be the end. So here at CC, we're focused mostly on students ages 4 to 18, but this is a great read for parents as they send their kids out the door to be thinking about what those next options are. So,
well, Lee has already mentioned on our last episode and elsewhere that she and Doug Wilson have a personal relationship going back a ways. One of Doug Wilson's earlier books that we aren't looking at here, it was Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning. So he's clearly friendly to a lot of what CC does. But can you tell us a little bit more about that relationship and what you know about Doug and Lee and Doug's support of classical Christian education and maybe CC in particular?
Yeah, so Doug Wilson and Lee have both been pioneers of the classical Christian renewal, and the Lord has called them to that in different ways. But because of their zeal for classical Christian renewal, they have had a friendship. So Doug and his wife Nancy founded the Logos Classical Christian School, which is thriving now in Moscow, Idaho. And as you and I were talking, Tim, a lot of people even date the classical Christian renewal in America to the founding of that school. Yes. It's usually a point that people put in the timeline. So that's a really important school. He also was one of the founding members of the ACCS, the Organization of Classical Christian Schools, and also a founder of New St. Andrews, which is one of the classical Christian college options. And so he's just been a big voice in the classical Christian education renewal. And he and Lee both feel very passionate about that. And also where they share a lot of common ground is the idea that parents are the sphere of authority for their children's education. And also the idea that it's not possible to have a secular education. So that's one of the cages maybe that Wilson sometimes rattles, is that it's not possible to have a neutral secular value-free education, that's not an option that's left open to us. So they share a lot of common ground, both in the history of the renewal and just some of those points of view.
Thanks. So Amy, it's good to have you with us today. So this little book, it's not a very big one, is kind of a hodgepodge in a sense of essays that Doug Wilson has written. They're collected here. Most of them have something to do with specifically Christian themes, not all of them as clearly as others, but why is it maybe that you think that classical education and Christian parenting sort of go hand in hand?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. We were talking about Paideia, and I think as we get put more into that definition of the word, that the idea of Christian parenting, just starting there, I think Wilson starts with that in that first essay with Ephesians 6, the role of the father and the structure of the family. So I think when we start thinking about Christian education and classical education, we really have to start back at that idea where the truth of Christ permeates everything. It is the absolute definition of truth, of reality. And I think as Christian parents, as we wrestle and grapple with that idea and apply that into our thinking and our actions, our words, thoughts, and deeds, as I always say with my children, that that establishes that Christian parenting. And I think that the idea as we model and practice those truths of Christ being central to all truth and holding all truth together, as we do that, we've established a culture within our own family. So, and so when we get to that place, we think, well, now how are we going to train them? What habits can we incorporate in our family? We can do the character and virtue and honor as we, just get to the breakfast table. I don't know if that was ever a problem for you all without pushing and shoving and grabbing the Mickey Mouse spoon. And so, so that can be incorporated, but as parents, for us, really trying to think, okay, how can we do the formal education of how our Christianity works in the formal setting of educating? And that's really where the classical model comes in so strongly to support how Christians think. It shadows or supports the idea of how man is designed. I mean, the idea that we are rational beings, that classical thought looks at the entire person, not just the thought of the person. It's not fragmented out by your own, your character is as much part of that ideal man, as they call it, as your thinking is. So that, of course, is a beautiful truth that Christians hold to. And then the idea that the universe is really knowable. It's something outside of ourselves. So we can know, it's predictable. We can use our rational thinking. We can use our words that we have been gifted with to apply that as we learn and know about the creative order that classical education has given us structures of the way to discover and explore the world. And so to me, it's just this perfect. It's not, I use the word marriage but that's too strong of a word, but it's just such a good foundation for parents to launch out and to bring their children along in a way that is fully integrates the idea of objective truth, that the cosmos is knowable, that it's something that we can learn and explore in, and that it's not just what we think, and it's not just segmented into these subject areas. It's not fragmented at all, but there's this unity of it, and it also applies to how we actually practice those things. So to me, that's what was such a blessing to discover when for our children to go, oh, there's this whole curriculum, this whole way of thinking that mirrors very much of the values. But what I love about it is Christianity takes us even further, doesn't it? Because then not only do we know about just the world and our nature, but we begin to see the divine nature and power and eternal power of God. And I don't know how much more you can get excited about things than that, to go beyond just thinking wonderful thoughts to thinking very high and theological thoughts. And so I feel like classical education really sets you up for those conversations. So yeah, it's very important. So as you can tell.
Yeah, I love that, Amy. I've been thinking a lot about those habits lately, just habits of discipline and attention that we see all through scripture.
Yes.
You first start cultivating in your home, but those are the things that usher our children into the Paideia of God, into worship and service. And so that's one thing I've been discussing with my challenge 2 students this year as we read through Proverbs every week. It's just that beautiful marriage between the idea of getting wisdom and then the habits that allow them to do that, which sometimes is strange to them, that, you know, that Latin could be the thing that prepares them for prayer, or that math could be the thing that prepares them to worship. So
Yeah.
I think I cut you off, Tim. Were you about to add
No,
to
that's
it?
fine. That's good. I was thinking that there's something too about the classical education model that emphasizes the student as being formed into an adult, right? That we're not just treating them as perpetual students, but that they're growing to something. And Christianity comes along and tells you what that something is, right? That they should be growing into the image of God that was built into them, right? That they can become better, fuller reflections of their creator as they grow in their virtues, right? The way it is to be more human. That's like, right, the classical idea, to become more human. The Christian idea, to become more human because we're in the image of God. And so together you have eternal purpose and not just a worldly one.
Yeah, I love that. I was thinking about that just yesterday, because I was looking at our some curriculum that we're working on for poetry, and thinking about the fact that you often will hear people say, well, every culture has always had poetry. They don't always have prose, but they've all had poetry. And of course, as Christians, we can extend that to say 2 things. One is that we are God's poem that he's writing. We see that in Ephesians, and then also because of that, we do create poetry. And so that's another great marriage that we can see here of the classical and the Christian. So fun. Oh, we could go on all day, but I have to thank our sponsor. So we, as always, we are sponsored by classicalconversationsbooks.com, where all the books we are discussing can be purchased, and you can get the entire 2024 and now the 2023 Words Aptly Spoken calendar at leebortons.com. And all of those calendars have links to the CC Books site so that you can pick up the books and watch the episodes either on our archive there on YouTube or on the website. So as Tim said, next week we will be on a break for some on-site company meetings, but then we will be back the last week of the month to talk more about this idea of worship and education as we discuss the book Echo and Celebration. So Tim, you want to get us back into the Paideia of God by Wilson?
Great. Yeah, so we'll dig into the text of the book a little bit in the second half, as we always do. We've been sort of hinting at and talking around that big word, Paideia, that is there in the title, and we've talked a little bit about it, but it, being classical education people, we of course want to define our terms, but rather than defining it ourselves, let's listen to what our author has to say about it. So, Jennifer, would you mind reading from the first essay?
I'll be happy to. I can't remember if his name is Werner or Werner. Is it Werner?
I think it's Werner.
I think it is Werner. Werner Jaeger, in his monumental study of Paideia, shows that the word Paideia represented to the ancient Greeks an enormous ideological task. They were concerned with nothing less than the shaping of the ideal man who would be able to take his place in the ideal culture. Further, the point of Paideia was to bring that culture about. To find a word of comparable importance to them, we would have to hunt around for a word like philosophy. To find a word of comparable importance in our culture, we would have to point to something like democracy. The word Paideia was as central to the thinking of the Greeks as the idea of the proletariat is to a Marxist or cash to a televangelist.
That's good.
There we go. We're not pulling punches. It was not a take it or leave it word like whatever the original Greek word for shoelaces was. So the word paideia goes far beyond the scope and sequence of what we call formal education. In the ancient world, the paideia was all encompassing and involved nothing less than the enculturation of the future citizen. He was enculturated when he was instructed in the classroom, but the process was also occurring when he walked along the streets of his city to and from school. It included walking by the temple for the gods of his people. That too was part of the process. There's a lot
So-
in that short quote.
Sure is. So what do you think about that, about Paideia?
I think it's a very clear description of what reality is, isn't it? I mean, we don't just learn facts that as human beings, we're whole. You know, there's a wholeness about us. So Paideia reflects that idea that to me, it reminds me that section reminds me of that Deuteronomy passage where, you know, when you sit, when you walk, when you lie down, when you rise up, the idea that it's so encompassing, and that is more in line with being an image bearer. You're not just a peg in a wheel, or a little gear in a wheel somewhere. You're actually a soul with a body, so to speak. So yeah, I love that.
I was trying to think of a modern analogy. The closest thing I could come up with was the air we breathe or the water we swim in. Those are things we commonly say when we're talking about the culture that we live in. And I was also then thinking, so I'm going to go in two different directions, and then Tim, you can fix it. So the other thing I was thinking is that we're at a curious moment where Christian Paideia is not the water we're swimming in with our kids. And so we're trying to enculturate them into something else than what they're seeing every day.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a big part of it, that especially as Christian homeschoolers, that we're trying to build that culture, right? To imbue as much of our family culture, our Christian culture into our children as we can while we have them at home to do it, because the world around them is constantly trying to enculturate them in a different culture than we have. So the movies you watch, the books you read, the music you listen to, the conversations you overhear at the mall or on the playground, those are all things that will influence you and build a culture. And, you know, I think the CC curriculum is a really helpful thing to give breadth and depth of understanding of like human culture, right? Broader than our cultural moment, so that there's some perspective that way. But the things like how you treat your siblings, or I mean, we aren't going to talk about that essay that that was referenced earlier about clothes and and school, but why do we dress up when we go to church, and what does that mean? Why is that part of our family culture, our church culture, or Western culture? It has to be intentional
Yes.
to understand that it's all one thing and not separate things. Otherwise, it loses its potency.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I was thinking today because Mia's downstairs. I only have one left at home. It's such a strange moment in my life, but Mia's downstairs today reading Pilgrim's Progress, and I said to her, you know, she loves to read. Especially she has liked the Challenge 2 literature so far. And so I just said, you know, I want you to know as you're reading this morning that this is one of the most important books you'll read, because I was also thinking about our time here and the Paideia of God. But if you want to talk about a Christian classic, that book is one Christian classic that ushers our children into the Paideia of God, into living as Christians should live. And Bunyan's story of all Christians journeying through this world is such an important part of ushering them into their journey through the world and helping them avoid those pitfalls, just like he does. So I don't think I was overstating the case to tell her it's possibly the most important book she'll read all year.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
Mm.
Yeah, I think so much. I was thinking about that too, that as we're establishing a culture in our home and hope and helping our children grow into the and be hopefully sanctified, redeemed into the image of God, of Christ, that part of it is helping them both remember. I was reading in Deuteronomy again this morning, and part of it is remember, recall, remember, recall. And so recalling the acts of God, recalling how God's faithfulness, recalling how we pray, how people praised him, how people fell away from him, to have that rich culture of conversation in our home and making it a natural, intentional act. And I think for me, the challenge really was, and this is why we recaptured both generations, right? It really was something I had to embrace. I had to be intentional. It was a redemptive act in a sense for me and my husband, that we were like mindful that these people are watching us. So are the words coming out of my mouth, the actions they're seeing, and even the values, like, do we put down our phones and have a conversation? Do we, that I think that's one of the things that has really influenced me, is that what are they seeing? Because we are establishing a culture that they don't have a context. Like, I had a context of a public school culture, but they don't have that context. So what context are we establishing for them? And making sure it's not just a list of little do's and don'ts, just seeing rich conversations, good questions, wrestling with things. How do you forgive someone? How do you, let them see that being I think that's what God intended for us, is to see it being played out in this small place so we can apply it to other places. But yeah, it's a great thing to think about. I'm glad she's doing Pilgrim's Progress. That's a good kickoff for Christian literature for sure.
Yeah. Well, we've already talked a little bit about how parenting and Christian and classical education go together. As homeschooling parents, we all know very much that academic instruction and parenting are not really all that different for the most part. Different
Right.
content, right? Just because you're teaching math or Latin or geography doesn't really make the lesson or relationship super different than teaching a kid how to tie their shoes or to wash the dishes or to sit still and listen during church, for example. So we all know that there are challenges for both the parent and the child, though, in that, right? That we have to have that commitment and intentionality as parents, as instructors to our children, and not give up when
Right.
things get hard, right? We expect them not to give up. But Amy, you're just saying how we have to demonstrate, we have to live out in front of them. So we have not give up when we're teaching things like obedience, which is not always the easiest thing for us or the children. So Amy, will you read us a little bit from the next section?
Oh, yeah, sure. It says, the Bible teaches us something very important about the nature of discipline. Now, no chastening seems to be joyful for the present, but painful. Whenever any son or daughter of Adam encounters academic discipline, they are not discovering something that is necessarily fun. The ground, since Adam, has never yielded its fruit without labor. That's a good sentence. School is work. School work is, work. But because, as Neil Postman has observed, we have adopted the entertainment mode of education, as seen on TV. Whenever we run into this uncomfortable thing called work in our studies, we think that something has gone wrong. If it's boring, it must be bad. And whenever we think that something has gone wrong, we ipso pronto hustle our children off to a specialist who discovers, I love this part, that they have Lowe's looking out the window syndrome. The entertainment model of education wants the students to enjoy themselves. The older classical model wants students to be disciplined so they come to enjoy their work. If we insist that every moment of education be fun, whenever the inevitable large amount of necessary work sets in, we must conclude that something is seriously amiss, particularly if the students have learned that it is profitable to yelp. I just love it. His phrasing on that. Yes, I would agree. My daughter says hard is not bad. That's her phrase. Hard is not bad. So that's true.
Yeah, I love that. I think about this a lot with because there are certain things we do that don't yield immediate fruit. So one of the things of as seen on TV is we all want immediate fruit. I do this thing for a few minutes and something amazing happens. And that's just not how an education works. Anyone who has sat down to teach their children how to write lowercase letters or sound out words in a phonics reader knows that it is not instant fruit. It is not always joyful. It is work. And I particularly think about it a lot with my students. Latin seems to be the place where that they feel this rub the most of the idea of schoolwork being work. And so we, for the last, well, too many years to count, I think I've been talking to my students about that section in Screw Tape Letters, where he talks about the fact that when you go from the boy who was reading myths in the English to buckling down to translate a sentence from the Greek, something very important happens. And one of the important things that happens is that those students become less easy to tempt. And so this is another place where we see our parenting and our classical education coming together, that those moments of discipline are the things that build spiritual discipline.
Yes.
You know, I mentioned attention earlier. So attention is necessary for prayer. Discipline in translating Latin is the same discipline that allows us to read scripture. It's the same discipline that maybe helps us not be so attracted by the shiny new objects that are coming into our view all the time. So.
Yeah, or to leave the phone down on the table instead of snatching it up the minute it buzzes at you.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And to see also, to me, that idea of helping them see those connections. You know, when I was tutoring or directing Challenge 1, and they're moving into those algebra, you know, pre-algebra kind of, and they would be moaning, you know, and how many students have probably millions have said, what am I going to do with the, you know, I don't know why, it must be in some kind of genetic code that people say that, but so we would stop and pause and think about what is, when you solve an equation, you can what does it do? What do you apply? Well, you have to apply logic. You have to be under the authority of rules and laws that do not bend. 4 will not bend. It will not be anything else but 4. And then some equations do not have solutions. That's uncomfortable. And some equations, you may arrive at the wrong solution. And so thinking about, well, how does that mirror anything we do in our walk with the Lord? And so at that point, they're like, oh, so maybe just the discipline of applying a logical, rational thinking under the authority of someone else besides yourself that is unbendable, to think, okay, maybe there is some point in this. But I think helping them fill those gaps. I think because we all need that higher call that inspires us. For me, it really inspires me to push through, to persevere. It's just like when we count it joy when we encounter trials, not just because it's hard, but because it produces a fruit. And so and I think God he inspires us in that way to keep persevering, because we know it's going to actually accomplish something greater than ourselves. So I think even when we're talking with students, to help them make that little jump of, no, this is more than what just sitting here with an exponent and X's and Y's on a page. So, and that had to happen with me when I had to work through that. I had to wrestle through, why do we do math? Why do we do algebra? So that's it. It does it both ways. That's what I love about that, working with your kids. It goes both ways.
That reminds me, Amy, of what Peter says in 2 Peter 1, right? When he says, for this very reason, make every effort to add to your faith goodness. And then he goes on with all these other things you're supposed to add. I'm like, just adding goodness is hard enough, Peter. Why are you asking me to do more things? This is too hard. But I think there's a two-prong hard, this is too hard thing that goes on. Or there's two outcomes to encountering something hard. I think the first one is what Doug talks about here in saying, there, as a parent, you look at it and say, well, there must be something wrong with my child, my student, if it's too hard for them. Or the other is this there must be something wrong with this thing I'm asking them to do. And that's too hard. So it's either an internal or an external thing. And the first one is when you send your kid off to the teaching specialist or the psychiatrist or the psychologist to find out what's wrong with them, because this is hard for them, when in reality most of the time it's just hard. Or the other one is when you switch curriculum every year, because you're like, oh, this math curriculum is hard, we need a different one. Oh, that math curriculum is also hard, we need a different one. Well, guess what? Math is hard. So do the hard thing. Time to yield the fruit. I think all the really, really valuable things come from doing hard things. Things that are easy to do are rarely all that valuable.
Yeah, I can think of two instances with my own students. One is that it took us 2 years of translating Latin scripture to get to when we ended the second year. On week 30 of our community day, we translated the last verse of Revelation and got to think about God. We won't need lamps anymore because we'll have the light of the Lord. So that reward was 2 years delayed. Them getting to see the beauty of the language of the Latin translation of that scripture was 2 years delayed. It required a lot of memorizing endings and combing through verses and looking up words in dictionaries and writing out charts and remembering rules. But when it came, boy, it was beautiful. Wonderful. But it came 2 years into the process. And we had a similar thing yesterday. We had all these fractions that we were looking at that had multiple variables in them. So talk about the comment about why do we need to do this? I heard that a lot yesterday as we had these 5 variable fractions that we were trying to get a common denominator. And the students kept saying, well, just multiply it times b squared. And I said, really? Is that what you want me to do? So I'd write it on the board and they'd go, well, no, it has to be b squared over b squared. Why? Well, because that's 1. And then eventually, after we did that over and over and had that discipline of the rule, then we were able to think about the fact that there are an infinite number of ways to write the number 1, just like there are an infinite number of things to experience about who God is. And so that's a special moment, but you don't get to it just by saying God's character is infinite. You get to it by reminding them literally hundreds of times, do you really want me to multiply this times b squared, or did you mean something else? B squared over b squared equals 1. And just, I had to say it over and over and over through the hour before. So there's just that beauty of the catechism is what leads to worship.
Yes. And to me, it's like the treasure in the field, right? So as you recognize the value, when you start recognizing that value, you give everything. I mean, like that ending, like to come to the end of Revelation, it's such a culmination and celebration. So that's, but it does, unlike television or whatever, YouTube, it may take 2 years. And we need to say that is good. I think what I see with younger parents is that there's such confusion of what they've been told, that this is what education is, and that it should be child-centered, and it should be this, and it should be that. And so they end up, even as believers, feeling very pulled, and to say, recognize this is good, this is true, and to point to scripture as an authority of this is how God works, and it's good work. So, but it takes faith, doesn't it? You have to trust that it works. So yeah, it's great. That's a great example. Love it.
Well, I've got one more brief thing
Yeah.
to encounter in the book because we've had some good conversation. Don't want to leave off because we've talked a little about some of this earlier about this whole unification, right? That we're a unified being and that we can't separate out and say, well, I believe that with my mind, but I believe this with my heart, or I do this thing, but I don't believe that thing. So he talks a little bit about what he calls intellectual schizophrenia, right? Where we think that we can sort of put our faith on the shelf when it comes to things like science. But I wanted to read this short quote for us. He says, "The modern opium dream that education can be religiously neutral should be, in our minds, equivalent to the question of whether or not, to use Dabney's phrase, schoolrooms should be located underwater or in a dark cavern. Neutrality about the ultimate question can be pretended in education, but it cannot be accomplished. Therefore, all schools and all departments must confess that Jesus Christ is Lord over all."
Yeah, that's good. Like Amy was saying, what we're talking about is not a child-centered education, but a God-centered education.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
I was thinking that it would be like if I had said I was married Monday through Friday and not on the weekends. It would be ludicrous to say that. And there was a nice speaker I went to Repairing the Ruins this summer, and I heard a science speaker say, describe as just a scene with his son who just got out of a dissection with a frog dissection at a lab, and asking, well, what was it like? And he was like, it was okay. He said, well, if I was going to do it, I would have you in the natural world looking at frogs down at our pond and drawing pictures of frogs and touching frogs and listening to frogs and watching them eat. And then he said, I would bring it into the lab and you would dissect it. And everybody's kind of stunned. And they said, because, and I was thinking about this, that Lewis uses this as one of his questions about how we learn. He said, you would recognize the sacrifice that has made, and that you would recognize the sacrifice of an author who wrote a book. You would recognize, and then there would be almost a reverence to when you go about dissecting this frog, and you would learn so much more than those little bitty parts of that frog. And I thought, when I was sitting there, I thought, wow, I wish you had been my science teacher, because it's like Paideia, it's everything. So it was a great example. So yeah, it's a way we can't segment God. We can't. It's ridiculous cutting God out. That's like cutting Einstein out of physics. Like, okay, why would you do that? So yeah, it's good thinking.
Did you want to have our closing thought, Tim? Do you have?
Yeah, I mean, I just think we do have this false idea that we can, read history without bias, or we can go into the lab and say, well, this is just all natural processes, without considering the fact that someone had to make those natural processes, right? And someone maintains those natural processes. We can know God better by knowing his creation, but we can't know creation at all without God.
Yes. That's so good.
Yeah, well, thanks for joining us today. Glad that you're with us, Amy, Jennifer. Thank you for the good conversation. And audience, we'll see you back in a couple weeks for Echo and Celebration.
Sounds great. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.